Hi everybody and welcome back to the course. Today we're going to pick up with the idea of the Franciscan vision for creation, its spirituality or eco-spirituality, how it's being received in the later 13th century in particular, and how it becomes increasingly a global vision. It's worth saying at this point too that global meaning, of course, throughout the world, internationally, but I think global can be understood in this context as modifying a vision of creation, a vision of eco-spirituality that is adaptable and appropriated in various contexts. And so one of the great benefits, one of the great sort of insights and richnesses of the Franciscan tradition is its diversity. The unity of the Franciscan tradition is a unity that exists amid great and really inspiring diversity. So what we're going to do today is take a look at two figures in particular. One is a lay Franciscan woman. Kind of anachronistically today we might call them a secular Franciscan, and some of you joining us for this course may yourselves be members of the Third Order of St. Francis, either of the Anglican Communion or in the Roman tradition, but know that our first figure, Angela of Foligno, is a kindred spirit and in many ways one of the many patron saints of the Third Order. We'll also look, as I mentioned in previous lectures, at some of the ways that Peter of John Olivi contributes to the Franciscan vision of creation and eco-spirituality with maybe a counterintuitive or at least not an easily predictable contribution. So more on that in just a few moments. So this lecture today is focused on what I'm calling Christian mysticism and ecological ethics. So first, let's begin with Angela Foligno. She is, again, anachronistically a secular Franciscan. We would say she's a member of the Brothers and Sisters of Penance in the late 13th century, a laywoman who was married and had several children. She has this experience as she narrates it herself in her two writings, the kind of authenticated writings or writings that we know that are tied to her. The first is called the Memorial, the second is Instructions. And when I say that she wrote these texts, I should add a qualification. As is not uncommon in that era, particularly for female authors, spiritual writers at the time, her writings were actually physically written by a scribe, a Franciscan friar, who in the text identifies himself or identifies himself through the eyes of Angela as Brother A. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. She is somebody who offers a distinctive contribution to Franciscan theology and spirituality. She has an interesting story, one that is the details of which are a little bit murky, a little bit unclear. What we do know is that she explains that at some point within kind of great succession, nearly all the members of her family die. Now, maybe this was due to an endemic or an outbreak of some kind of disease or some other sort of disaster. But her parents, her husband, and all of her children at a certain point are no longer living, and she goes through what we might, again, in an anachronistic way, there's a lot of A's and N's in there, has something of a midlife crisis. She finds herself drawn more and more to a life of prayer, to a life of penance, to a life of contemplation, to a life that is distinctive, and she is distinctive within her time, and that distinction manifests itself in the form of Franciscan inspiration. So she quickly sells all of her goods. She was not a super wealthy woman, but it's clear from the records and from her own narration that she lived comfortably, she was something of a woman of means. She appropriates the habit of the penitents of the time and situates herself as somebody who is committed to this lifelong journey of penance and prayer. She becomes then a very highly sought after spiritual director, not just for lay women and men in the town of Foligno and in nearby Assisi and other villages of the Umbrian region, but she's also sought after by kind of the educated class, the clergy, Franciscan friars, and others. She earns the name in her own time of the Magistra Theologorum, meaning she is the kind of teacher or master of theologians, the teacher of theologians. And why we're most interested in her today is because of her experience as a Christian mystic. Mysticism meaning in this case her ability to articulate and communicate her experiences of the divine. And the kind of mysticism that she presents, her own experiences, have for many generations been puzzling to some people and challenging. We won't get into all of that here. I bring that up merely to say that I think that's misguided. I think that part of it, the reason why not many people know about Angela Foligno, or who don't often until of late, she's gotten more and more attention, in no small part because in 2013 Pope Francis canonized her, so she's now Saint Angela of Foligno. But that her mystical encounters, her mystical experiences, don't necessarily align comfortably with what I think a lot of people would assume Christian mysticism looks like. And in particular, I think this is influenced in part by misogyny, by historical patriarchy in the church, that she is a woman mystic, a female Franciscan. I think that plays some role. We can't deny that. But the good news is her memorial and instructions have been garnering more and more attention. Scholars from various fields, not only historical theology or spirituality, but other fields are taking a renewed interest in her work. But I want to focus on, her experience of God, her experience of Christ, her mystical experiences, in particular as they might inform her understanding of creation. So I apologize, there are a lot of texts that I'll include here. You read a short excerpt that I'll come to in a moment. But what I like about some of these passages is that it shows her embodiedness, her understanding of a corporeal mysticism. And it's one where she vividly describes encounters with the divine that are grounded in her material being. Why is that important? Well, think back to Francis of Assisi. Think back to Bonaventure and Scotus in the centrality of the incarnation for the Franciscan tradition. Relationship is at the heart of the spiritual tradition of the Franciscan movement, but the incarnation is the condition, we might say, of the possibility for Franciscan theology and spirituality at all. And so we see this play out in a distinctive way in Angela's own experience. She writes in chapter 6 of the Memorial, "Once I was at Vespers and was gazing at the cross, and while I was thus gazing at the cross with the eyes of the body," so she's talking about the visualizing of the cross and reflecting on it, "suddenly my soul was set ablaze with love, and every member of my body felt the greatest joy. I saw and felt that Christ was within me, embracing my soul with the very arm with which he was crucified." Again, so rich, so vivid an image. But notice what she does. She's talking about physical visualization. She's looking at the cross. She's meditating. She's praying on the cross. Then she has a spiritual experience that doesn't just stay in some sort of ethereal realm. Right? This is not a strictly apophatic experience of negation or otherness. Not that there's anything wrong with those kinds of experiences of the divine. She has instead an experience that comes back into her physicality, back into her corporeality. She continues, she says, "This took place right at the moment when I was gazing at the cross, or shortly afterward," and then she adds, "The joy that I experienced to be with him, with Christ, in this way, and the sense of security that he gave me, were far greater than I had ever been accustomed to. Henceforth my soul remained in a state of joy, in which it understood what this man, namely Christ, is like in heaven, that is to say, how we see that through him our flesh is made one with God." So again, the centrality of the incarnation just permeates her own experience of the divine, but also her reflection on her mystical experiences as such. This is, as I said, very corporeal. It's very incarnational. It's really as Franciscan as you can get. It's Franciscan spirituality as such. Her mystical experiences then reflect both the physical and the spiritual senses. And here I quote the late Franciscan theologian Paul Lachance, who is without a doubt one of the greatest scholars of Angela Foligno in the 20th century. He says at one point that Angela sees with the eyes of the Spirit an incredible variety of visions of Christ and this is key for us, a view of the world filled to overflowing with the divine presence. She hears Christ speaking to her and in the final stages of her spiritual journey saying most high words that cannot be written, smells indescribable sweet odors, feels the warmth of the divine embrace holding her tightly. We got a glimpse of that in the previous excerpt that I shared. But this idea of embodied spirituality is key, and that it's not just, again, an anthropocentric vision. It's a vision that is inclusive. It's a vision that is rooted in an understanding of the world as deeply interconnected with the human experience. Therefore, her spiritual encounters manifest themselves in sensory experience, so that, as Paul says, you have this audible recognition of Christ speaking, the smelling of the sweet odors, the idea of touch and warmth and the feeling of the divine embrace. Okay. Her visceral sense of the divine in the world is always grounded in returns to creation, and that's why I emphasize this. That again, it's not an escapism, it's not a kind of strict apatheticism. It is a lived, embodied, creaturely kind of form of mysticism. And in this sense, she's deeply Franciscan in her experience of prayer. The last thing I want to return to is something that is without a doubt my favorite passage from Angela's memorial, and you read this for today, or at least yesterday, I should say. This passage is really quite striking. She says afterward, and she's recounting to her scribe, Brother A, this kind of experience of the divine. She says, afterward God added, I want to show you something of my power. And immediately the eyes of my soul were opened, and in a vision I beheld the fullness of God, in which I beheld and comprehended the whole of creation. I love that. Starting with creation. God wants to show her something, and what is Angela's experience of God's invitation? It's an invitation to see the world, to see creation. And then in her medieval cosmology, right, her medieval understanding of how the world is structured, right, they didn't have a sense yet of a heliocentric model of the universe, or of the shape of the earth and everything. Again, this is the 1200s. She says, that is, I saw what is on this side and beyond the sea, the abyss, the sea itself, and everything else. So she just had this kind of overwhelming experience of the cosmos. And she says, and in everything that I saw, I could perceive nothing except the presence of the power of God, and in a manner totally indescribable. And my soul, in an excess of wonder, cried out, this world is pregnant with God. I love that line so much. It's so distinctive in a way, right? And I think this is maybe a less tricky, or less, I don't want to use the word offensive, but less discomfiting, maybe that's a better way to put it, of some of her own experiences of mysticism as narrated in the memorial. There are other encounters where she talks about tending to lepers, where she even consumes some of the water that's used to wash the sores of lepers, and sees this as a form of penance and as a kind of communion. Now, that can be kind of discomforting for readers, but even this language of the world is pregnant with God, it's this idea that God's presence is so pervasive in the natural world, and through all of creation, that it's like it's going to burst forth with new life. I mean, it's just, what a beautiful metaphor. And she summarizes again, she closes, she says, wherefore I understood how small is the whole of creation. On the one hand, its wonder and its extensiveness, but relative to God's love and God's presence and God's power, how small it is. That is, and she describes this again, but the power of God fills it to overflowing. So what gives creation its dignity and value? What gives creation its worth and importance? For Angela, it's this mystical encounter, this vision of the world where God's presence is so permeating that it animates, it gives life, which is very much in keeping with the Christian tradition's understanding of the doctrine of creatio continua. Now, you may not know that phrase. Many people are familiar with the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo, this idea of God who creates from nothing. But there's also a kind of comparable or complementary doctrine called creatio continua, in which the divine presence never is removed from creation, but God draws near to creation, particularly as Spirit, as the Holy Spirit, to give life to renew the earth, as the psalm says, to animate us, as we see in Genesis 2, right, where God breathes the Ruach Elohim, the very breath of God, the Spirit of God, into creation and gives us life. In this way, Angela is articulating this in a distinctively Franciscan valence, focused on this kind of incarnational, embodied, relational encounter with the divine that is mediated through the created world and not a form of escape from it. There's so much more. I encourage you at your leisure to read more of Angela's writings. They really are refreshing and distinct. I keep using this word of distinctiveness, but she's one of a kind and yet thoroughly Franciscan. That's what makes her so wonderful. The next figure I want to highlight for us today is a Franciscan friar and theologian and scholar that, again, is not super well known outside of academic circles. And this is Peter of John Olivi, a contemporary of people like Scotus and Angela Foligno. He dies shortly before the turn of the 14th century. He's born around 1247. He enters the friars at a young age, not unlike Bonaventure, not unlike a lot of friars in the Middle Ages. He has a lot of theological promise and therefore studies theology at Paris. And he happened to overlap at Paris around the same time Bonaventure was there, at least for a portion of it. My guess is that Bonaventure was at that point Minister General and comes back. One of Bonaventure's last at present indefinitely incomplete manuscripts is his Hexameron, his commentary on the 6 days of creation, which was delivered near the end of his life, long after he had left his academic post at Paris. So what exactly the influence of Bonaventure was on Olivi is not entirely clear, but there was some overlap, to be sure. After finishing his studies, he taught at various studia, both in France and Italy. A studia, or a singular studium, is a term that is probably most likened to like a regional seminary in today's language. It's a school, it's what we would today call a graduate school of ministry that was intended to shape and form and educate, in this case, Franciscan friars for pastoral ministry. So it's where they would study theology, where they would study scripture and the rest. So it wasn't quite as large or complex as, let's say, the University of Paris or Oxford or Cologne, but it was a true academic post. And so he had several of these and therefore was primarily a teacher to other friars in formation. He was pretty prolific. Not a lot of his work has been translated into modern languages, but the work of the critical editing of his text is still underway. It's something that is in process, and he notably writes a lot of scripture commentaries in addition to a few theological treatises. And some of those theological treatises become the source of controversy, and I'll say more about this in just a moment. He dies in March of 1298. So what is the controversy? Well, Olivi, if we think back to Francis of Assisi inaugurating and Clare shortly thereafter, their vision of evangelical life is premised in part on an understanding of evangelical poverty, a way of following Christ that will come to be known in Latin in the Franciscan movement as sine proprio, to live without anything of one's own. And so poverty plays an important role in the Franciscan tradition. And as the Franciscan movement in the mid-13th century, certainly toward the end of Olivi's life, as you're moving into the late 1200s, the Franciscan order is quite large and very influential. A number of popes have sought to capitalize on this and grant special favors to the Franciscans, and they're engaging in kind of missionary efforts. They're taking over parishes in some cases, which causes its own sort of controversy. They very quickly, as we saw with Bonaventure and now with Olivi and others, are present at the high institutions of learning like the University of Paris and Oxford and elsewhere. So they're becoming, we might say, mainstream in a way. And they're very popular. They're popular with most lay people because in their pastoral ministry, the Franciscans are perceived in contradistinction to their secular colleagues, meaning the diocesan priests, in part because they prioritize preaching, much like the Dominican order did at the same time. They prioritized meeting people where they are, being present to them in the town squares, preaching using imagery and examples and narratives that were relatable. And so they were drawing a lot of attention. And what we see both in the popular sense in terms of pastoral ministry, but also in the academic sense, is not everybody was keen to accept their popularity or their vision. And so one of the great debates of the mid-13th century was over the meaning of evangelical poverty. It's sometimes called the mendicant controversy. And this kind of reaches its boiling point at the University of Paris in the mid-1200s, when there are debates with other teachers, other scholars of theology about the meaning of evangelical poverty and about whether or not evangelical poverty was a necessary component of authentic Christian discipleship. You can see the vested interests here, right? So on the one hand, the Franciscans felt very comfortable with this claim, as did other mendicant traditions like the Carmelites and the Dominicans at the time. Yet on the other hand, the so-called secular clergy, the diocesan clergy on faculty at, let's say, the University of Paris, were very offended by this because it seemed to then put them on the defensive. Are you saying that I have to live like one of these Franciscans? What's the deal here? So forth. So that's kind of brewing in an academic sense and at a high level of debate within the university. Within the kind of Franciscan world, within the kind of mendicant world, Olivi, again, he's teaching primarily not at the University of Paris, but teaching at Franciscan Studia. So he's tasked with the formation of younger friars, these guys who are going through their studies. And this question keeps surfacing. It becomes a hot button issue about what does evangelical poverty mean specifically for Franciscans. Now, the vow that Franciscans, myself included, profess is a vow to live sine proprio, without anything of one's own, which simply means we do not appropriate, we do not claim right to property. However, you have to use property, even if you don't claim it, you don't own it, it's not yours, quote unquote. There is use that's necessary. And so Olivi felt that there was increasing laxity around the way that many Franciscans were understanding sine proprio. A kind of modern example I come up with sometimes and use is like, if you had a very expensive car, let's say the latest model of a Mercedes-Benz, and let's say that a generous benefactor bought one of these and turned it over to the local Franciscan community and said, here, this is your Mercedes to use. We want to support your ministry. This is a very reliable car. Pay no heed that it cost all this money. The friars, on the one hand, the question is it a violation of the vow of poverty? Now, technically, they don't own this car, right? It's being handed over, it's being lent to, it's being used by these friars, but it's owned and purchased by some other party. So one interpretation of sine proprio says, well, it's not mine. I'm just driving it around to go to the store, or to go to celebrate Mass, or to visit the sick. I'm using the car. Olivi felt like this could be abused, and it was in some context. It could be misunderstood. And his question was, his response, his query was, I don't think that this is sufficient. It's not enough to say that we can use whatever we want as long as we don't have technical or juridical ownership over something. And so he proposes that the authentic way to understand sine proprio is through this doctrine of usus pauper in Latin. It literally means poor use, but that's misleading, because poor use of something suggests that you destroy it, or that you're not a good caretaker, a good steward, and the rest, right? Poor use of a rental flat in London means that you trash the place, as it were. That's not what he means. He means really restricted use. And it's in response to whether, as I mentioned, the Franciscan vow of poverty demanded that friars renounce ownership of property alone, or if it entailed a kind of restricted use of goods, in addition to that lack of formal ownership. So as I say here on the slide, Olivi believed true renunciation of ownership meant that any property or goods the Franciscans had access to, practical if not nominal ownership over. And I think that's an important distinction. If the only person who's using that Mercedes-Benz is the friars, then they have practical ownership over it. They may not have juridical ownership over it. Whether that is, justifiable or not, whether that's in keeping with their commitment to evangelical poverty. So, again, his concern was the seeming disconnect between the discernment about what was of actual necessity and what was merely a luxury. And therefore, he outlines how one can come to this kind of reconciliation. How does one make right this question? How does one live an authentic embrace of this vow of poverty, or this vow of sine proprio more specifically? And in two major writings, he unpacks this proposal of his of usus pauper. Now, I want to talk about the controversy for a minute before I get into what he actually says. Even within the Franciscan community, there were some people who thought this was too radical. They thought, wait a minute, I vowed sine proprio, nothing of my own. That's what I vowed. I didn't vow anything beyond that. But you also saw that this, in the kind of secular context, saw this as sort of a threat from the mendicant perspective. Again, this sort of larger cultural conversation at the universities about whether or not evangelical poverty was a necessary component of Christian discipleship. There is a fear, both within the order and outside of it, that Olivi was advocating a rigorous, strict, and unforgivingly ascetic way of living in the world. And at first glance, if you hear this doctrine like, poor use, restricted use of things, is this a form of kind of runaway asceticism? Is this a form of, divestment of oneself that is, as I say here, kind of radical or unnecessarily strict? But what's striking about reading his texts themselves is that Olivi actually offers a very nuanced and fluid principle of discernment. And that's our key focus today, the principle of discernment. His purpose is to take into consideration more than just blind acceptance of, as long as I don't in name or de jure own something, if I don't have the deed in my name, then I can do whatever I want. Olivi wants to reintroduce a principle of discernment into the process of going about the world. And so in his writings, he talks about considering social contexts, political values, economic values, need that people have, among other factors. This need point is really important because even Francis of Assisi adds qualifications in the rule of the order that says, for instance, the brothers should, when in a chapter where he talks about their attire, they should have certain clothing that is not ostentatious, footwear that's simple or barefoot. And he says, but obviously, and I'm paraphrasing here, this is my translation from the Latin, he's like, but obviously if you are a friar who's living in northern Germany in the wintertime, appropriate footwear and warmer clothing is completely acceptable. So there becomes kind of, as with Francis of Assisi, sadly so with Peter of John Olivi, there's a lot of caricaturing, there's a lot of stereotyping, a lot of superficial analysis or assumption that takes place. And what's important for us to realize is that Olivi is actually engaging in a very nuanced, robust, discerning principle. So in one of his treatises, for example, he says, okay, because our question might be, well, then what does usus pauper look like in practice? And in one point, Olivi says, one can deduce what we mean by usus pauper, namely, that usage which, all things considered, is fitting for the evangelical poor and mendicant. And there can be diverse grades of it, fitting, more fitting, most fitting. I mean, it's so straightforward about there's nuances here. And it's most fitting. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you're in the northern German context in winter and you need warmer clothing, then it's most fitting that those friars have appropriate, let's say, boots or jackets or warmer habits or that sort of thing. But it would not be fitting just because it's a luxurious sort of amenity for somebody in another climate to claim that same right, or that same right usage, to put it more directly. In his questions on evangelical perfection, Olivi writes that the criterion for discernment is, again, in keeping with what was just said, that use which all circumstances is considered is more consonant with the poverty and condition of Christ than with the condition of the rich. So in this regard, we might see Olivi as a forerunner of the 19th century slogan that became popularized in the late 20th century in terms of merchandising and bracelets and t-shirts and stickers and that sort of thing. Namely, what would Jesus do? Olivi offers a kind of a nuanced, complex, theologically rich a way to approach this question about living in the world, the use of things, and it's effectively, one way to think about it, he proposes is, well, what would Jesus do? Is this the kind of thing that Christ would engage with himself were he alive today? Now, the answer to that question is not always clear, much like it's not always clear what is fitting, more fitting, most fitting in different circumstances. And so it's about discernment. So the question might be, okay, this seems to be about, property, Mercedes Benzes in my example, or, clothing or something like this. What does this have to do with creation? Well, I would argue, and this is not Olivi's point, I don't think Olivi would have imagined exactly this application, but I think for us in the 21st century, it's an insight, a keen insight into a Franciscan vision of ecological ethics. In other words, as I say on my slide here, it provides us with a principle to help negotiate a very important tension that exists, that I think most people either don't consider or find, as an impasse. Namely, how do we negotiate the fact that we defend all of God's creatures having intrinsic dignity and value on the one hand, right, by virtue of their hakcheitas, by virtue of the fact that they're part of one family of creation, as Bonaventure says, that they emanate from a single divine source, right? We have one common source. How do we negotiate that tension with recognizing the everyday necessity of our instrumental use of some aspects of the community of creation? The last meal you ate was made possible because animals and plants died so that you can eat. The clothing you wear is derivative, especially if it's leather, from certainly a deceased animal, but even fabrics like cotton and the rest. Or to be really abstract about it, even synthetic clothing that we have or plastics are produced from petroleum, which is millions of years of decomposition of previously living creatures, right? You can see how this integral ecology, as Pope Francis says, plays a role in every aspect of our life. And so there's no way that a living organism, including a human person, can function independently without this interdependence, interrelationality that we've been talking about. And as such, we have to eat, we have to clothe, we have to shelter, we have to use creatures. Just as, God willing, when we die, we allow our bodies to decompose into the earth so that other life might also share from our experience of living and then not living. A bit awkwardly phrased, but I hope you understand my point. As I mentioned, all creatures require the use of other creatures for survival, and I think where Olivi's insight is especially helpful here is in thinking about normative attitudes or habits that we as human beings form around the necessary instrumental utilization of other creatures. What do I mean by this? I think an adapted usus pauper, right? Thinking about it specifically with an eye toward Franciscan global vision of creation, offers us a general disposition, right? It's not a ready-made answer. It's not a one-size-fits-all answer book. It's a disposition. It's a habitus, as Aristotle and then Aquinas might say, right? It's a habit that we cultivate that can aid us in our discernment about what is or is not necessary in terms of ecological justice and care for creation praxis. How do you actually go about exercising, living the principles that we claim to believe, to assent to? As a principle, as I say here, usus pauper in this context always requires that the individual and the community reflect intentionally on the practices surrounding and the instrumental usage of non-human creatures. So what does this mean? Is our destruction of this plant life necessary? Is it fitting? Is our farming practice of monocultural farming, for instance, is this appropriate? Is this fitting? Is this right usage? Is this usus pauper? The way in which we engage with disposable products, uses of plastics, whether or not we recycle, these kinds of questions are consumer practices, factory farming, and that grotesque practice. Like, can we think about how we participate in these destructive practices to the environment, and what lens do we use to discern that? On the one hand, we have to eat, but do we just eat whatever's most convenient or that we'd prefer, or do we take into consideration some of these other factors? That's usus pauper. How do we use these other creatures? And I think, this is not new. As I say in my last point here on the slide, we can look to the wisdom of many, many indigenous cultures, peoples around the globe that safeguard traditions of communal discernment and practice around the taking of non-human life for instrumental uses. here in the U.S. context where I live, there are many tribes of Native American peoples who have a long tradition of recognizing a spirit of gratitude for the animals and the plants that have, quite literally, to quote or to paraphrase John's Gospel, laid down their lives that we might live, right? And so do we overkill, as it were? Do we over-farm? Are we destructive without reflection? This is the challenge placed before us. And what does it look like in practice? How do we shop? What choices do we make? When and where do we dine out? Our clothing choices, the ethical issue of factory farming, or the treatment of animals that we use as livestock, plastics, meat consumption, energy use, our travel habits and choices. All of these are kind of grist for the mill when applying this principle of usus pauper. So with that in mind, I think we'll wrap up for today. It's a little bit longer of a lecture than usual, but I hope that this has been worthwhile in giving you something to think about, to, pun intended, digest, to process, to engage. On the one hand, Angela's magnificent and inspiring and challenging mystical experiences that provide us with another glimpse at the life of Franciscan prayer and Franciscan approaches to creation. And Peter of John Olivi, who, again, not widely recognized, but offers us a distinctive contribution to negotiating the challenges of ecological justice and ecological ethics in our modern world today. So I look forward to joining you for our last lecture soon.